And of course, details is a big thing, so I'm going to be adding nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts for everybody. Anybody want some nuts and bolts? Because I got nuts and bolts everywhere. Add nuts and bolts everywhere that we need to add them. Nuts and bolts, nuts and bolts. Do you know what? One more nut and bolt. Anything else need a nut and bolts? Because I'm giving out nuts and bolts everywhere. Alright, we're good. We're good on nuts and bolts for right now. Alright, that looks so good. The blocking, I'm going to add another 20/20 back here. Then we're going to add some nuts and bolts as well while we're here. And I'm thinking about just keeping them the same color. Because you can add nuts and bolts and change the colors of them. But I don't really see us needing to have a different color. So let's just start adding them, because it's my favorite time of the day. Nut and bolt time. Nut and bolts for everybody. Anybody need a nut and bolt? Because I got a bunch of nut and bolts right here. Nut and bolt right there. That don't need a nut and bolt. We could add a nut and bolt right here. Nut and bolt right here. 2 more nut and bolts. I'm giving out nut and bolts for free today, guys. It's a non-stop nut and bolt day. We could actually add that right there. A nut and bolt. Maybe a nut and bolt right here too. Let's add 2 more nut and bolts. Look at these nut and bolts. They look great. Should we get some nut and bolts on the wedge itself? I think some nut and bolts belong right here. Boom, nut and bolts. Nut and bolts for days. 2 nut and bolts up here. Aye aye, Captain. Nut and bolt. I'm really liking this robot though. Nut and bolt on the pupils? That'd be weird. No more nuts and bolts. I'm getting too crazy with nut and bolts. Oh, I need some nut and bolts on these though. Other than that, no more nuts and bolts. I'm cutting myself off from nuts and bolts. I'm cut off. So with that being said, let's jump into my favorite time of the day, the nuts and bolts time of this episode. We're just going to be adding nuts and bolts to any place that we can. My whole thing about this is this robot is so big I can't even see where I want to place the nuts and bolts. So that's a big problem for me. Some nuts and bolts right there. Some nuts and bolts right there. Nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts, slide them over. Nuts and bolts, nuts and bolts, nuts and bolts. This robot didn't really need a lot of nuts and bolts, honestly. And what I want to do, first of all, I'm going to name this robot Nuts and Bolts, only because it's time to add some nuts and bolts, guys. Now, nuts and bolts are going to be kind of weird in this right now, just because I want to add them all in here. So this is going to be a weird little cut. But bear with me here. Ready? Nut and bolt time, boys. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. A little nut and bolt right there. A little nut and bolt right here. A little nut and bolt in that corner. If I can shimmy my way over there. Shimmy a nut and bolt in this corner as well. Ooh. Somebody order a nut and bolt, because I have a nut and bolt right here. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt on top of a nut and bolt, might I add. Here's a nut and bolt for you. Nut and bolt for you. Here's a nut and bolt. Knock knock. You're supposed to say who's there, and nut and bolt. Nut and bolt who? Nut and bolt for you. A shut and sholt. I'll put a nut and bolt right here. Why not? Make this nut and bolt cyan too. Nut and bolts. Ooh, nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. A nut and bolt. I have a nut and bolt right here. I hope you guys realize that nuts and bolts are going to go on this entire robot. Like, there's not going to be a spot where nuts and bolts aren't going to be, just because this robot's name is Nut and Bolts. And I plan to do over a full kilogram worth of nut and bolts on this robot. I'm just saying that right now. I hope you guys expect that, because nuts and bolts are going to be everywhere. It's going to be too many nuts and bolts. And I hope you guys are understandable, because this is going to be crazy. It's going to be gross. It's going to be disgusting. People are going to have to call the hospital because there's too many nuts and bolts. All right? I think this might be too many nuts and bolts. I'm not sure. No, that's not possible. There's no such thing as too many nuts and bolts. In fact, I think it needs more nuts and bolts. I think it needs twice as many nuts and bolts. I think it needs to be completely filled with nuts and bolts. And I think this robot is essentially complete. Actually, I take it back. We need to do one more thing. We need to add nuts and bolts to this robot. Am I right? We need nuts and bolts. We need nuts and bolts. Where are the nuts and bolts? Give me the nuts and bolts. Where are they? So for the nuts and bolts, I've been kind of thinking, I want these nuts and bolts to especially be a certain color. And I've been thinking, I kind of want it to be this midnight blue. Yeah, I think that's going to look real good. Okay, so I'm going to start adding nuts and bolts to everything. And let's get to it. Nut and bolt right there. This corner definitely needs a nut and bolt. Probably a nut and bolt right there. Man, we lacking on the nuts and bolts today. We need to add more nuts and bolts. A nut and bolt right there. Going to definitely a nut and bolt right there. A nut and bolt right here. This is definitely nut and bolt potential. I think somebody ordered a nut and bolt in this area. Nut and bolt. We need a nut and bolt right here. And a nut and bolt right here. Nut and bolt in the back. Nut and bolt right here. Nut and bolt. Nut and nut. We're adding a nut and bolt right here and changing it. That's right, changing it to black, and add another one of them right here. We added all the nuts and bolts that I think would look good. Now I think all we have to do is just add some nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts. A nut and bolt down here. Oh, nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolts. I hate to say it. I only think there's not that many nuts and bolts to add. This was definitely a robot that didn't need many nuts and bolts. That I can see, at least. Like, everywhere that I added is a place where nuts and bolts should go. So there is one final thing that I want to do with this robot just to get it all squared away and ready to fight, and that is nuts and bolts. Now, I don't see a lot of nuts and bolts on this robot. I am cutting this very close, but I don't think we're going to go over the weight limit either way. So I'm going to add some nuts and bolts to this robot and hope it doesn't really affect the weight. I doubt it, but there's only one way to see. So let's start adding some nuts and bolts. Nut and bolts. Newton boots. Definitely a nut and bolt right here. Nut and bolt right there. Nut and bolt down there. And another one right next to it. Nut and bolt. I guess a nut and bolt right here. Nut and bolt down here. Change it to white. Nut and bolt. A little nut and bolt. A little bit of nut and bolt in my life. A little bit of nut and bolt all night long. A little bit of nut and bolt is all I need. A little bit of nut and bolt in the sun. A little bit of Monica in my life. And this is nut and bolt number 5. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt on the wedge. One more for the fun of it, I guess. And that is all the nut and bolts that I think this robot is gonna get. I have been made aware that I did not do nuts and bolts in the previous episode, and I'm mad at myself for that. So we're going to be doing nuts and bolts in today's episode, just because nuts and bolts are fun, you know? They're always fun. So without further ado, guys, it's nut and bolt time. Nut and bolt. I'm going to change the color of nut and bolts to, yeah, that orange is really nice. Nut and bolt. 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 Nut and boot. Somebody ordered a nut and bolt right here. I don't know who it was, but they got it. Nut and bolt somewhere down here. I'm not sure where. Like right there, maybe? Yeah. Nut and bolt. One right there, perhaps. Something. And one right there. I guess 2 down here. 2 nuts and bolts. 2 in 1. 2 1 special. Another 2-fer. Nut and bolts. Nut and bolts. Nut and boot. Yeah, Shamund. Yeah, one right there. And another one. Alright, time to make the nut and bolts the shark color, because it's time to do more nut and bolts. Nut and bolts. Nut and bolts. Nut and bolts. Yeah. Yeah. What am I doing? Nut and bolt. Sneaky boy down here. I think this robot's pretty much done, and I wanted to add nuts and bolts to this robot because the old school robots, in my opinion, they have nuts and bolts on them. And I think most robots that I like have nuts and bolts on them. So we're going to start with the nuts and bolts, and I think this robot's going to be nuts and bolts heavy, actually. I'm thinking I'm just going to keep them this color, but we'll see from here. So let's start with the nuts and bolts. Nuts and bolts. Nut and bolts. Ooh, nut and bolts. Nut and bolt. We're going to do the same on the bottom with them as well. So nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Yeah, right here. Nut and bolt on top of the wedge. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and... nut and bolt. 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 Going back on the back of the robot now. We're going to add a nut and bolt right here. And nut and bolt right here. And we're going to do it on top back here too. And one right here. Nut and bolt on the wedge. We're going to do 2 close to each other. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. I think it is time for a certain classic theme that always comes on this channel. It's time for nuts and bolts. I'm not saying this robot's done, but I'm saying it's good enough to slap some nuts and bolts on it. Of course I want to add some detail, probably up here somewhere, but I'm not exactly sure what I want to do yet, and I'm probably going to need a couple days for that to do, so we're jumping straight into nuts and bolts. So without further ado, it's nut and bolt time. Nut and bolt, nut and bolt, nut and bolt, nut and bolt. Nut and bolt, nut and bolt, nut and bolt. I believe there's a nut and bolt shortage right now, so we're gonna have to put some nut and bolts down right here. I seriously can't find another spot to put a nut and bolt. Is that bad? Is that bad? I'm already out of nut and bolts. Alright, the robot is down to 109, and it is time for nuts and bolts, guys. Nuts and bolts is my favorite time of the year. It just makes me so happy. So, without further ado, let's jump into this. We have a lot of spots, in my opinion, for nuts and bolts, so let's jump right into it. Nut and bolt, nut and bolt, a schmat and nut, nut and schmat, a nuta and a boota. A snooter and a boot ho. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Yeah, nut and bolt. Nut and boot. Nut and bolt. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Yeah. Yeah. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt, nut and bolt, nut and bolt. Over here as well. One right there. Yeah, we did it, guys. We did it. Nuts and bolts over. And now it's time to do my favorite part, guys. I haven't done this in such a long time, and I've honestly missed it so much. It's time for nuts and bolts. Let's go. Here's a nut and bolts. Here's a nut and bolts. Oh yes, a nut and bolt. 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 Yeah. Nut and bolt. Nut and bolt. One right there. Oh god, I just realized something. I'll get back to it. Nut and bolt. 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 I think we're done with nuts and bolts. I mean, it's not bad.